Greetings everyone, welcome to yet another content from Throttle Alpha. I know it's been a long time since we have reviewed a motorcycle unit, but I really wanted to put up a first impressions today on this new KPR 200. We are all going for a road trip to a nearby farmhouse. I'm gonna get some road to present this bike to you guys. I've been riding this motorcycle for around 200 or 250 kilometers so far, for about a week or 5-6 days. So I can give an ideal input on the very first impression on the newest edition, the KPR Plus or the KPR 200 being put out this year, or will be releasing this year. So, since we all know the previous KPR did quite well in our market, the KPR150 and the KPR165R, these bikes came in carburetor and EFI variants. This motorcycle, however, is a fuel-injected bike. This is a EFI motorcycle, so you don't have a carb variant for this bike. But basically, this motorcycle is the newest addition to the KPR franchise, and it's been 5 or 6 years since the previous KPR model wasn't updated. But this is a fully new, updated KPR, and it came with a facelift. So this makes this bike very special, and this is the first international review for the Lifan KPR 200. It's an unreleased motorcycle. We have 5 bikes traveling together. We have a Gixxer, we have a GSXR, we have a FZS version 1. We also have a very good looking version 3 with us. So as far as this short road trip covers, this bike is a very catchy bring to the market because the Bangladeshi displacement limitation, we were limited to only 165 cc's before. But in recent times, the displacement limit got uplifted. So basically, the current uplift on the displacement limit has allowed importers to bring in motorcycles of a quarter-liter class or 200cc bike. So being the newest addition to the current existing competitors, you have the Charisma XMR 210 and you have the N250 being the prime competitor for this motorcycle. And if you look otherwise, you have the Gixxer SF and bikes of those segments willing to be its competitors, because the pricing for this motorcycle would be in a very ideal and a sweet spot. If you can get this bike for a good price, I think its competitors would fall behind in a few places. I would straight up go to the point and break down what's good and what's bad with this motorcycle. Number one factor, which is what is good with this bike, it is the smoother engine. The engine is smoother. What I mean by that is that the KPR used to be a bit rough with the gearbox, but I have to say the gearbox in this bike is very charming. The gearbox feels a lot lighter and a lot smoother, and the engine grunt or the engine acceleration is not very rough. Yes, it's a 200cc motorcycle. You're supposed to feel the raw power, and this bike has that. This bike feels very KPR in that sense. You have that raw torque kicking in, but I think for the engine and however it is, the engine feels a lot smoother. I think the addition of a 4-valve engine setup in a 200cc bike keeps the power and the commute figures quite connected. This can be used as a city bike, and the power output is well controllable. Going into higher gears, you still have that torque kicking in, and wherever you're going to lower gears, you still have that torque responding ideally with the gearbox. So I think these are the few phenomena that makes the engine very smooth. And as I've mentioned about the commute part, I think the handlebar setup being quite similar to the previous KPR, it makes the biking feel very comfortable. So I think the handlebar layout is quite CBR alike, close to chest feel with the bike. So I think that way it makes the bike feel a lot more comfortable in city rides. This bike being present in my Eid holiday, I'm quite enjoying riding this bike around because I usually ride my GSXR and I have a cafe racer and I have a cruiser setup. But in a sport touring layout, I think I was missing out riding such a motorcycle where I could comfortably commute around with. So I think this bike, in terms of commuting or going slow in the city, I think this bike does justice as well. The plan for the day is that we would travel around to a farmhouse. We're gonna swim there for a bit, and in the meantime I'm gonna try to break this bike down to you guys, show you around a bit. So this vlog is not intended to be a full review because number one, this bike still has a lot of braking to do. I'm not gonna push extra hard with this motorcycle because I will give it a final look once the bike has its braking done, and also this bike is ridden around for 5 to at least 6,000 kilometers, and that way you can really put up how the engine performance for the motorcycle is. But for now, this bike has done a 300 to 400 kilometer turnabout. I can tell you this, that however this bike is operating so far, this bike is doing quite well. And I would add to the fact of comfort that this bike does not feel heavy. You have a carb weight of around 160 kilograms. So this bike being this heavy, The weight is quite well distributed, and I think this was the case with the previous KPR as well, that you did not feel the weight to your body. So this bike handles the weight distribution quite ideally as well. I think you have a ground clearance of around 140 millimeters. So I think even for short riders, the seat base being a bit low or the central point being a bit low, I don't think you feel much of the weight of the bike to the handle or to the body. So I think the 160 kilogram weight, it really helps the bike feel grippy and helps with the torque punching the body downwards. So I think the overall job with the weight management is a pretty solid work done. So I think this is a wiser suspension test for the bike, and the ABS is handling quite fine as well. And I think one of the most serious upgrade in comparison to the older KPR is that the suspension setup for this bike is handling the bike a lot better. I mean, I don't know if it's the damping has been changed or if the springs are new. I don't know what's been done. Maybe the suspension's upgraded, but this bike handles bumps and manages jerking a lot better than the older KPR. The damping is better. I mean, you're getting what you're paying for. The older KPR was priced at a very nominal price segment, so you can't expect everything to be aligned. But for this motorcycle, I mean, however it is performing so far, the bigger bumps or the larger potholes or even the off-road, I think this bike is managing quite right. No problem whatsoever. We have reached our destination. So far so good. This place is very peaceful. A lot of greenery. You have the river by that side. That's the bridge. And a lot of greenery. Looks very peaceful. So we had a pretty fun day, and I did break down how this bike is, and in terms of smoothness and riding in rough terrains and on the city road as well, this bike does pretty well. So as much as the smooth riding capability this bike has, if we come to one of the most primary upgrades of this motorcycle, it would be the facelift. Just look at it. It looks very beautiful with the sharp edges in the front and the DRL in the front side. I think this bike looks very, very beautiful. You have a edge-to-edge cutout to the rear as well. If you look at the rear, the tail has been lifted. The previous KPR sorta had a split seat, but the seat was still deviated to the lower side. But this one has an uplifted seat, and I think this looks much, much better. And you still have those LED tail light as well. And as for the engine, this engine is a 4-valve SOHC setup. It has a 17.5 Newton meter pulling work capability and a horsepower output of 20 horsepower at about 9,000 RPMs. So I think in terms of top end, this might miss out a bit on top end power, but the primary objective of this motorcycle is to be a torque puller. 20 horsepower at about 9,000 RPMs is good enough in our highway conditions, and the torque that this bike is pulling around 17.5 Newton meters at 7,500 RPM, I think this bike does justice to however it's been laid out. And of course, the previous KPR segment was missing out on a dock layout. This bike does not come with a dock setup as well. There's a SOHC setup, but I think this overall new engine setup makes this bike a bit more friendlier to ride with in the city with the torque. As much for a 200cc engine, while this bike moves later to the quarter-liter class or the 250 class, I think then a dock layout would do much justice to this bike. But for a 200cc torque puller, I think this bike does pretty good. The exhaust note for this KPR is way better than most other bikes in this segment. I think this exhaust might seem a bit odd to a few people, but for the way it sounds, I think it's pretty good. And for a 200cc engine of this class, which is very torquey and which is a SOHC setup, I think the delivery of high notes or the delivery of thick notes in this exhaust is pretty smooth, and I think this does sound better than the previous variants that this motorcycle had. This motorcycle holds the same tank as the previous KPR. This is the 14-liter fuel tank from the previous bike. You get 14 liters and you're pulling almost around 35 to 36 kilometers per liter with this EFI system. The previous KPR did have a bit of heating, but I think this bike has a bit of it covered by the padding that the tank has underneath the tank. You have a anti-heat padding added beneath the tank and the seat as well. So I think these features were a bit thoughtful with this motorcycle. And I think the cooling system is pretty much optimum. Like whenever you're switching the bike off, it takes a bit of time to shut down the radiator system. So I think this was a pretty good work done with the ECU, where the cooling management was much better than before. And as for the braking, you get dual channel ABS in both the brakes. You get a front ABS system and a rear ABS system. And to be fairly honest, the tire setup that this KPR comes with, the braking and the tire combo feels much better than before. The weight did not actually give a feedback where you felt very confident with the bike at top end speeds. But this KPR, however, really feels very confident to brake with. So the tire has been a good work done. You get a 100 section front tire and a 130 section rear tire. So I think the tire combo was a sick job done, and the stopping force for this KPR is much more linear in that account. And I think with the overall weight distribution being very good, you get a good braking output with this bike. You have a grab rail pattern plastic knob here where you can grip the bike, or the pillion can grip the bike, and you can also put your arms here where you can grip the bike. I wouldn't suggest it because since the seat is kind of moving and the damping here is a bit odd, this one is a bit inconvenient. But I think holding the rear part from this side has been a good addition. As you can see, you have a gap at the rear which T-covers this part. The gap helps the pillion to grip the bike better from the rear. And the tail tidy finish was also pretty much nice. This bike has a LED indicator setup, so these are pretty visible as well. These are pretty visible. And as much for the chain and the sprocket setup, I think you can actually swingle around and change the sprocket setups a bit to test out the power output or the torque output for the bike at different sprocket setups. But whatever this bike came out with for the engine power, I took this bike out for a mild run. Since this bike does not have its brake-in done, I did not force the bike much. I couldn't to a top speed of around 134 to 35 kilometers per hour. But I think in optimum conditions and with better fuel, this bike would do an ideal top speed of around 142 to 147 kilometers per hour, and aftermarket stage or tier updates to the engine might do a bit more justice. And another serious update to the bike is the footrest position. The previous KPR had a foot peg position which was a bit to the front, but I think the position of the foot peg being brought to a bit backward side, the look of the bike or the feel of the bike becomes a bit more aggressive, and it supports a good cornering punch as well. So as much as I've discussed a few pros for the bike, I think I would like to mention a few cons with the setup. So the number one con that I figured out is the console or the dash panel. The console or the dash panel, it comes pretty much with the same previous layout. You get the same master cylinder, the same bolts or nuts from the previous KPR. So I think the addition of minute details would have done a bit more justice to the bike. Number two would be, I think the instrument cluster, it's a digital system, but it looks a bit, I don't know, funky. And as of the previous KPR, the fuel sensor in the tank, it mismatches the instrument cluster. They don't give the same result. I took 3 liters of fuel in the bike, it's still showing empty. So I think these small phenomena really impact users in the long run, and I hope they update or upgrade this instrument cluster here. This is not the final unit, so it's not the final verdict. You have a USB setup in the dashboard panel, which is helpful for a touring option here with the bike, and you have adjustable clutch system. And as for the mirrors, I think the mirrors are not functional much enough. You don't get much of a good viewing angle from these mirrors. Probably hope all the users would update this to an aftermarket option. And another issue with the bike would be a lot of users might complain the rear tires to be a bit thin. I think a 140 section tire would look much better with the overall layout, but a 130 section tire actually does much justice to the performance. You get good cornering speed, you get good average velocity, you get good mileage. So a 130 option was ideal, but I think a 140 section rear tire would have looked much better. Like imagine this part with the tail tidy and with the rear panel taken off, you get a much beefier look with a bigger tire. So that was missing out. One of the most sensitive issues with this bike is, just like other Lifan bikes, this bike is very sensitive to bad fuel. If you put random fuel to this motorcycle, this bike really misbehaves. You get a bad start or a back kick to the torque. You at times get the bike to switch off. So such issues needed to be cleared out in the fuel line section or the fuel assembly section. So I think this bike is still sensitive to fuel like the previous KPRs. So in terms of technicality, I don't think that this is a serious problem because the octane issue, it really messes out with a lot of bikes in the market right now. And technically these bikes are a bit sensitive to fuel. But if you look at every other bike that is running on an EFI system, I think that all these bikes are sensitive to the bad fuel we have. So rather than uplifting the displacement part earlier, we should have worked on better fuel in the market. So since that's a bummer, I think we should be really careful where we're taking fuel from. So this was about it for the KPR 200. I hope this video helped you understand this bike a bit better. Once this bike has a lot of mileage covered and the break-in is done, I guess we can give a better feedback on the motorcycle. Do follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and do stay subscribed to our YouTube channel. Till the next one, guys. Manaisa mare Jack, thank you. একটা হ্যাঁ চ্যানেলের নাম থ্রটেল আলফা মনে থাকবে কি নাম? থ্রটেল আলফা। হ্যাঁ থ্রটেল আলফা। হ্যাঁ থ্যাংক ইউ।